With each issue of SAPIR, we try to talk to 3 or 4, sometimes 5 different authors, just for the sake of enriching the conversations that we are trying to have through SAPIR, through the Maimonides Fund. And you wrote a really superb, beautiful, I would say lapidary, very personal essay for our latest, our 8th issue of SAPIR, Judaism Without Borders, Diaspora Without Tears, in a volume devoted to the subject of culture. And really the subject is, you're talking about what it means to be a Jewish novelist in not just in the 21st century, but sort of in the following a period of a kind of a great efflorescence of the Jewish novel between, Saul Bellow, Malamud, Roth, a great many other people who kind of almost defined the American, I didn't even mention Norman Mailer, defined the American novel, and Cynthia Ozick, I can't not mention Cynthia, defined the American novel for almost 2 generations. And now you belong to the generation that comes after that. Your first novels were published really right after you were in college, and starting in the late 80s and in the 1990s. And so I want to begin, Allegra, with an anecdote that you tell at the start of your essay, which is going back 14 or 15 years. You were at a conference at the Radcliffe Institute in Cambridge, where the feminist literary critic Vivian Gornick was speaking on the subject of Jewish American literature. And you talk about an exchange that Gornick had with the historian Stephen Zipperstein, and the nature of his question or comment was, does Jewish American writing continue, and are others carrying on the torch? And then you capture Gornick saying, "No, sweetheart, you don't understand." So let's begin with that point in your story, in your essay. What is it that Zipperstein didn't understand?
I think she was trying to make a point about a certain historical moment. And of course, she's lecturing the historian, Steve Zipperstein, but she was trying to say that, yes, there may be Jewish writers now, but the flowering of American Jewish literature was really that they represented that, and that moment is past. And also that Jewish American fiction can never be mainstream and celebrated in quite the way that those 2 writers were, Bellow and Roth. They were both very Jewish, and they were also just celebrated as great American novelists. Bellow won the Nobel Prize, Roth wanted to win the Nobel Prize, didn't really make it, but won everything else. And, so she was taking a very kind of a narrow view. She wanted to make a very narrow point. And I guess, it all depends on how you define art and how you define reputation and how you define the evolution of artists. So she stuck to her guns.
And this traces your own evolution as an artist. Some of your earliest books, The Family Markovits, Paradise Park, Catterskill Falls, I remember reading when it came out, had really explicitly, overtly Jewish themes, central Jewish characters. You just had your most recent novel, Sam, a coming of age story about a young girl named Sam, by the way, it's getting rapturous reviews. You've hit the sweet spot when you get a gorgeous review in the Wall Street Journal and a gorgeous review in the New York Times. It's almost miraculous. But in Sam, there's really the Jewishness is really off stage, and it's been true of much of your more recent work. In fact, you have a story which I read this morning in the New Yorker, which is a wonderful story, but unless unless I'm missing something, is really just about coming to terms with a divorce and an ex-husband moving on in his life. So you use this beautiful expression in your essay when you talk about how the Jewishness has become like almost a watermark on the page. Expand a little more on that subject, on what it means to have a watermark of Jewishness in your fiction, in your literature.
Yeah. So, sometimes it's still overt, and I'm still writing stories. Mostly, a lot of my short fiction is really very overtly Jewish in its content. And the story that you read, I can't believe you read it already. Just like
it was the first thing I read this morning.
Hot off the internet. It just came out. That's part of a sequence, which is, really, really Jewish in its content. That particular story, not. But in context, it is part of a book, which I would say is very much a latter day family Markowitz. So my point is, I never stopped writing about Jewish people, Jewish themes, and all of those things. I was really interested in sort of expanding my view and expanding my subject. But I still think that, there's always some connection to Judaism in my work. It's often not cultural. And this sort of ties back with Vivian Gornick's point. She is a secular Jew, like a certain kind of feminist, kind of New York secular Jew. And she was very interested in Bellow and Roth for their cultural Judaism, which was very strong in their work and made a huge impression at the time. And I think that cultural Judaism is not so much my subject, actually. I am interested even in those Jews who are not culturally Jewish, who may be far from the center, who may be very assimilated, who may be intermarried, who may be non-identifying as Jewish. Or as my character Sam's father says, non-practicing, that Sam doesn't even realize that he was Jewish until they have a conversation, an offhand conversation about it.
About Hanukkah.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about that because so when it's really, and you quote it in your essay for SAPIR. It's a snippet of conversation. It turns out to be a detail. How important was it for you to write those lines? How does it inform your sense as an author of who Sam's father is? Because you talk about him elsewhere as a guy who is always telling lies about the future rather than the past. And so you sense in the larger context, an identifiably Jewish character, kind of a Jewish loser, but for sure, a Jewish character. How much of you was sort of infused in those lines, or do you go back and look at it and say, oh yeah, I just kind of stuck this in?
No, I always thought of him as Jewish. And, and as a Jewish writer, like I perceive a lot of my characters as also Jewish. But he is a Jew who's, you're right. He does have that kind of wandering, kind of happy, sad, bittersweet, kind of artistic, there is a trope there that is somewhat Jewish, but it's very much not at this, it's not at the center of his identity that Sam knows, his daughter knows. It's not something that he transmits directly to her. It's very oblique. And that oblique connection to Judaism is something that I see in our community. And since I take the entire Jewish American community as my subject, that includes those people for whom Judaism is not the center of their lives.
Let me ask you about, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about your work, but I also want to talk about you in the context of writers roughly of your generation. And you mentioned a few of them: Michael Chabon, Jonathan Safran Foer, Nathan Englander, Nicole Krauss, Omar Friedlander, Molly Ann Topol. To what extent do you sort of think of yourself as situated in that community, or is it just accidental?
Well, I think that writers, it's hard to say about artists are so individual, and each of us has our own aesthetic and each of us has our own interests. So, I think I can name those names. It's not like we sit around the table necessarily
Yes.
and talk, but through our work,
Councils of the elders of Jewish novelists.
yeah, that's not happening. But we read each other and we're aware of each other. So in that way, we talk through our work, I guess. But I would say that each of us is has different focus. And again, the subject is so big. There are Jewish writers of my generation who are writing about the Holocaust or the effect of the Holocaust in really interesting ways. There are writers who write sort of about in much more personal ways about their own, identities as Jews, in more memoir, I should say, than fiction. But it takes many different forms. So I guess, I would say it's a very loose community. No. And also in my essay, what I didn't want to do was generalize about all of us, because we're all so different. And if you had asked each of us to write an essay, it would have come out extremely different. I'm sure that their answers to these questions would have been very, very different from mine and from each other.
I'm just going to make a general note here to our audience that, as with all of our conversations, at about the 40-minute mark, I'm going to start taking questions and just posing them to you, Allegra. So if you have questions as they occur to you in the course of our conversation, as Allegra is speaking, put them. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom bar. So just put them in there, and I will try to get to as many questions as I can, especially the ones that end with question marks. So just bear that in mind as we carry forward with our conversation. I want to ask you, Allegra, just in a broad sense, you have this wonderful line or series of lines in your essay. You say American Judaism is rich, it is also impoverished, it is flourishing, and it is also dying. You go on to say, my work is about Judaism and its specificity and its lingering traces. In some of my books, Judaism is overt on the page, and others it is barely invisible. You have that beautiful line about the watermark. You also say in America, our community is deeply divided and at the same time resurgent with Jewish learning in day schools and adult education classes. This renaissance seems to me a vital subject. We live in an age of assimilation, but also the age of Sepharia. So it's wonderful because you're capturing really in such a succinct way the paradoxes of Jewish life, artistic life in particular, in this day and age. So how does an artist manage to capture that kind of duality about Jewish life today? Or what are the mechanisms by which you explore both that kind of richness and that impoverishment?
I think as somebody who writes fiction, I explore it by dramatizing it. So for example, another story in the same cycle as the one that you read this morning is called Apple Cake. And in that story, the matriarch of the family dies, and she's been in hospice for a really long time, and it gets to the point where nobody can stay any longer. So they have Shiva for one day. Shiva by definition, which is 7 days, is one day. And to me, so that is one way of, without saying it, showing it as fiction writers do, that they're Jewish. This is the Jewish family, and they want to sit Shiva and honor her memory. And at the same time, they have no time. And so they alter the tradition. That's one way. It's sad, it's funny, it's, some would say, ignorant, and so showing those paradoxes. And also because I write many stories and many different kinds of books, I look at things from different angles, and taking those different perspectives and different points of view, I'm able to capture some of those contrasts and paradoxes that I describe in the essay.
One of the ways in which your perspective shifts is geographic, and I want to ask you about this because you were born in Brooklyn, moved to Hawaii when you were very baby, I guess.
Yeah, too. Yeah.
Grew up there, went to was it the same high school that Barack Obama?
Yeah, I went to Punahou, which is where he went.
Punahou, the prestigious high school in I guess Honolulu, right?
Yep.
And then moved back to the States, and you now live in Cambridge. What does the change in how have these changes in geographic perspective affected your writing and your understanding of your characters?
Well, as somebody who grew up in Hawaii, I really did grow up on the edge of the American Jewish community. You know, sort of like what Vivian Gornick was describing, like I was way west of that,
Yeah.
you know, like 13 hours by plane west. So as I described in the essay, I didn't have a lot of experience with institutional Judaism growing up. And it wasn't until I moved to the mainland, as we call it, you know, that I knew what a JCC was, that I saw what a Jewish, you know, what a thriving Jewish youth group might be. I didn't have an option to go to a day school. In, you know, my school, Punahou, was founded by Christian missionaries in the 19th century. So I went to a Christian school. You know, so all of that, and again, and within the United States, within the mainland United States, continental, there are places that are also removed from this sort of institutional Judaism of like Los Angeles or New York. But it gave me a different perspective on things. I did spend time in New York in the summers, and especially in the Catskills, which is where I got the memories and experience that I drew upon in my novel Catskill Falls.
Yeah.
So I was a bit of a participant observer, but I was also an outsider coming from way left field.
Did you feel, just a quick question, when you were growing up in Hawaii, your understanding, I mean, obviously you must have gone back to the mainland for vacations and so on, but to what extent did, you know, the Philip Roth or the Bernard Malamud or whoever, the novelistic view of American Jewry influence your perception of what that community was about?
Really very little. I mean,
Yeah.
I wasn't reading them when I was growing up. My dad liked Saul Bellow, and I remember he had his novels, you know, and the kind of stuff that I was interested in becoming a poet. In college, I studied 17th century English poetry. Like I was not as clued in and tuned in as one might think. I was interested in Sholem Aleichem when I was young, and his kind of bittersweet ethos and his work really attracted me. But you know, but these other people, I didn't understand as much and didn't read as much. The one that really I was very interested in was Cynthia Ozick, who you mentioned, and she is their contemporary. And I liked her, the layers of her work. I liked her style, but I was also really interested because she's interested in spiritual Judaism. She is interested in that facet that goes beyond culture. And very early on, I was attracted to that. And that remains true of me today, that again, it's not cultural Judaism and institutional Judaism, which is ephemeral in my opinion, and can change, but it's liturgy that really interests me. It's religion that interests me. Religion in all its different forms, and spirituality. And that's what I found in her work.
Let me ask you about this, especially about your early work, because you really started, I think you started writing when you were a child. And I think your first published story was when you were 17 or some very, very precocious age. And if I remember, I haven't read the story, but if I remember that first story of yours about cattle,
and also much cattle.
Yes, was conceived in explicitly Jewish terms. To what extent was that really a very self-conscious choice, that you thought of yourself as a young woman coming of age as a soon-to-be Jewish novelist, or was that just the material that was at hand?
Well, it was a little both. I don't think I would have, I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to write plays. I wanted to write poetry. I just wanted to be a writer of some sort. Yeah. And it was the material at hand, because I was living in Honolulu at the time, and it was pretty crazy Jewishly. And my connection with Judaism was liturgical. I was in shul with my parents. I was in the service, and young rabbis did come out and lead the service. And so I was writing what I knew, as they always advise young writers to do. But I was also very interested even then in sort of intertextuality and the contrast between the grand liturgy of the Yom Kippur service and the squabbles of the people there, the people in the minyan, essentially. Those contrasts and that humor was what drew me and what was alive for me. And I took that forward.
When you were reading the Bellow and the other great Jewish novelists as a younger writer, this is a question I always have because it informs my own writing. I assume you sometimes go back and read them again. Is that right? No?
I wish I could say yes. I'll be honest. I have not reread a lot of them. What struck me about Bellow and Roth, I like their energy. I like the power of their work.
Yeah.
I would say that really as a young novelist, and as a child, the writers who obsessed me were like Victorian novelists. I was really interested in Dickens and Austen, and earlier than that, Austen. I was interested in George Eliot.
Daniel Deronda?
Daniel Deronda, which is my favorite Jewish book.
Mm-hmm.
And although not written by a Jewish person, Middlemarch. If you look at Catterskill Falls, which is my first novel, which I wrote when I was very young, and I started when I was about 20, you can see the stuff that I was reading, that is my Middlemarch. That is my Daniel Deronda and my Middlemarch. I was sort of like, what if I could write about a community the way she wrote about Middlemarch, only my community was Jewish? What if I could write about, what if I could have this scene where everybody comes together, only in Trollope it's a fox hunt, but in my book it will be a synagogue. What if I could write about the succession of the son to the father and the schism within the family and the community, but in mine it's a rabbi. So I was thinking in those terms. Those were the people that really excited me. And so for me, actually, me living on the periphery of institutional Judaism, Saul Bellow and Philip Roth were on the periphery of my literary imagination.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. I mean, I'm always interested in early reading, and in my case, I'm now in a phase when I'm rereading some of the things that meant a lot to me when I was younger, and then finding myself either seeing more than I did at the time, but sometimes just being disappointed in some of the literature that I loved when I was 20 and now seems sort of either dated or overwrought.
Sure.
When I'm pushing 50, which is a very different experience. But I want to talk a little bit about your evolution as a writer, because something seems to change at the turn of the century. When you're, without giving too much away, your early 30s. There's Dante wrote the Divine Comedy with ending Paradiso. I think he wrote it at 35. He talks about the middle of his own journey beginning in the middle of a dark wood, roughly at the same age that you published Paradise Park, which is a quest for God beyond Judaism via the Pentecostal church and studying religion, but then doubling back towards Judaism. So this may be a somewhat overwrought question, but you did publish a story called La Vita Nuova in the New Yorker in 2010. So what was there like a moment of transition that you felt, a self-conscious moment of transition in your own literary journey? Had you just phased out of something, or what happened?
I mean, I think of sort of every project as a kind of a new transition. So I don't, even before I published La Vita Nuova, I'd written this book about scientists, and I've written about all these different sorts of people and really experimented with different styles. I think that story, La Vita Nuova, which is one of the stories that people love the most that I've written, was a departure for me in terms of style, for sure. In that I was experimenting with this very pared down writing in that story. It was sort of much more minimalist. But it's all it's still connected, it's still very intertextual, just like my first story, and also much cattle, only here it's Dante instead of the Hebrew liturgy. So, I think that some people, as I've mentioned in the essay, think that I've, again, written less and less and less about, Jewish subjects. I think it all depends on what part of my work you're looking at, and I've still continued. Um, and, again, I like, as you said, take a small Catholic C, and I'm very curious. So I like to experiment.
I want to talk about your new novel, Sam,
Hmm.
because there too you are, I don't know if it's a stylistic departure, but it's clearly you've given a lot of thought to the way in which you choose your voice. And you trace the story of a coming of age story of a girl. It begins when she's 7. Her little brother is 2.
Yeah.
And it has that kind of very pared down voice that you would expect from the mind of a 7-year-old kid. And then it develops over the next 10 years of her life, her kind of her coming of age. So this is not even a Jewish question. It's just a writerly question. How did you make those decisions about how to inflect the voices of your characters and the way in which you choose to manage your prose?
That's a great question. I think that the way I would describe it is, I think of writing, and this is true of all my writing, my more Jewish fiction, it's all Jewish, whatever. I think of it as performance. So I was performing this character. So I started with the voice that you would enact somebody who was 7, and I grew her from the inside by knowing her really well and knowing what she would say. And voice is really important in all of my work, whether it's dialogue or whether it's using that very intimate third person that I use in Sam, where you're, up really close and you can see her perception, and you can also see her perception changing. So I would describe it as a performance, and just a performance based on knowledge. So that if you know the character, if you know the people well enough, you will know exactly what words they will use in different occasions. There was a moment in Catskill Falls where I sort of discovered that as a young writer. I was writing a scene where Isaac Schulman goes to see the famous rabbi, and he's worried and nervous about asking him a favor or question on behalf of his wife. And then the rabbi says to him, the words that mean the most to him, he says, "I remember your father." And it's sort of like, I just knew that the rabbi would say that at that time. And I knew that would mean the most to Isaac because I knew the characters. And that's what I aspire to, that just knowing them well enough so that, like, as with jazz, the instruments will talk to each other. The conversation will happen.
Another aspect of your writing that interests me is, you really you're just interested in your characters, and you're interested in a very rich variety of characters, and you're interested in the characters for, fundamental human experiences. You are not maybe correct me if I'm wrong, you're not a polemical writer. You're not peddling a politics or any kind of ideology. People are just rich and complicated in your stories, and I want to get your sense of what your views are about that kind of polemical novelistic fiction, what attitude you take toward it. Is it just not for you, or do you oppose it? What's your sense of the role it should play in the ecosystem of our literary imagination?
That's a really good question. It's definitely not for me. In terms of my work, I think it kills. I think it kills the life. Somebody said to me in the interview, so what is a lesson you want people to take away from Sam? And I said, well, if I wanted to teach a lesson, I would have taught a class. It's like, why do you write fiction? If you want to make a point about politics or polemics, then write an essay, in my opinion. Write an op-ed. That's a perfectly honorable genre. And you can make your point more directly. Why? So if you're going to write fiction, then what can fiction offer? What can I offer? I can offer intimacy, I can offer complexity, and I can offer ambiguity. And the ambiguity is contrary to the designs of polemic. So those things don't work. Now, is it possible to write a polemical novel and it still be great work? I love Steinbeck. I think Grapes of Wrath amazing book. I would say that's a pretty polemical book in a lot of ways, but it's still a great novel.
And Bellow wrote polemical books too. I
Sure.
mean, in some ways, Mr. Sandler's Planet is a polemical.
Yep. So I think it can be done. My work is sort of all in the wrist. I'm interested in lightness. My aesthetic has to do with not beating people over the head. I'd rather tickle.
Do you think when you talk about, I mean, I don't want to ask you to cast aspersions or make judgments, but when a novelist enters the political fray, that's always a kind of a fraught moment. And do you think there ought to be, I think about this in particular in terms of the Jewish question, there ought to be rules around that? I mean, Michael Chapman is someone I think about, who has sort of been pretty outspoken on Jewish issues, and of course it's touched deeply on his, in terms of his fictional the universe that he's created. But a Jewish novelist goes and makes a statement about, I don't know, Israeli politics or the state of the diaspora or anti-Semitism, one thing. Are there in your view, particular responsibilities to speaking as a Jewish novelist, especially when you're speaking about something other than your characters?
Yeah, that sort of gets into that nexus between being an artist and being a public figure. I guess I'm much more on the side of being an artist, and I don't feel quite famous enough to be a public figure. But I think that artists who see injustice or artists who perceive, a problem, they have every right to speak, use their name. I don't think it necessarily serves their art. It might serve a point, a political point, but I'm not sure it was served them well. Also, and one of the things I touch upon, and if we're going to bring up Israel, I'm really interested in writing about Israel that is art, and I think that the Israeli novelists are doing that, while the American novelists are doing a bit more grandstanding. That because we are on the outside looking in, perhaps. I'm interested in sort of that much more personal, much more intimate look at a country.
Have you ever been tempted to head on over? And
I've been to Israel many times.
I mean, but to head on over for the purpose of writing a.
Oh yeah, I don't know if I'd be good at it. It would have to be the right. I have to figure it out. I think that also Americans should have a lot of humility writing about a country that we don't serve in the military and vote, and I wouldn't want to legislate Israeli politics from over here, and I also wouldn't want to it would be very much an American perspective on Israel. So I have to see what I have to contribute.
Well, you raised something that's sort of interesting, because it's a little bit it has to do with the sort of the literary temper of the times, which is the idea that you should stay in your lane as a Jewish writer or a Irish or Black writer, that you have to be very, very careful about writing about other cultures, other experiences, having characters who will more or less resemble your own demographic. And this has become, I think, ubiquitous in the publishing industry. There's my sense is that there's a lot of nervousness and fear around some of these cultural hot button issues. Some novelists, friends of mine, a former guest on this little podcast, Lionel Shriver, whom you've probably read, has been.
I know her, yeah.
She's a friend of mine of many, many years, and she has been absolutely outspoken. And she really has a very polemical side to her, and is doing a lot of political writing in addition to her fiction. But how are these ideological or political movements, ideas, impinging on the life of writers? I mean, do you see it in either in your own experience or in the writers that that there's a kind of a more diffidence in terms of their writing, a certain kind of fearfulness, or not?
Yeah, I think that there that is all happening. I think that there's a tension. On the one hand, writers want to feel like that they can use their imagination and inhabit any world or any person. On the other hand, there's a worry about cultural appropriation or ventriloquizing the voice of somebody that they don't have no right to ventriloquize, all that kind of thing. And that is tricky. I think it's interesting also that people are selective sometimes in the criticisms of writers who do this. Philip Roth, I think, did a terrible job writing about women, for example, or writing about from women's points of view. So that may be a case where I don't think he was really able to fully inhabit that. I do on the one hand want to feel that I have a broad canvas, that I can explore where my curiosity takes me. And I don't want to just write about myself and my own limited experience. And on the other hand, I think you do need a certain amount of humility. I'm thinking, for example, of the Holocaust. Like, I don't think I would ever write a book or even a story that was set in the period of the Holocaust. I just don't feel that I have earned that privilege or that I have suffered directly. So I wouldn't take that on, to give an example. On the other hand, I think there's another extreme where you say, like, you can only write about yourself and your own culture and your own people and that sort of thing, which is very limited and can be very pernicious. So it's complicated.
But do you sense that the publishing world has changed dramatically in the last 10 or 15 years? Is it a new dispensation? I mean, I feel like we've gone through the equivalent of the 1960s, culturally speaking, and like an abrupt revolution in sensibilities. The only difference is that in the 1960s, people changed their clothes to kind of indicate the change, and now everyone more or less dresses the same as they did 20 years ago. But there's been that sudden shift, or do you not encounter and experience that?
I think to me, the more dangerous shift, honestly, is that people aren't reading at all.
Yeah.
I think that, we live in such a distracted age that people aren't reading. So that for me is the biggest shift, and sort of and also just sort of the biggest shift is technological rather than ideological and cultural. I think that those trends that you're talking about, and you're right, there is the sort of cancel culture that's going on. There is a desire for but the desire for new voices, I think, was there before. So I think it's a distraction more than anything. Now, you could say also that means that there are fewer and there's a smaller audience, so that people have to compete for that smaller audience, and then who is it that gets the spotlight? That maybe more of a culture of scarcity.
I think about that all the time. Just looking at young people, and I mean, when I was a kid, I always had a book. It's one of those
now
things.
They have their phone in front of them.
And now my kids are readers, but I think we're a bit of a special case. And even then, it's most of the time is some engagement with their phones or social media, and I worry that it's led to this gigantic hollowing out of our inner lives. Mm-hmm. That something has been like just a giant vacuum has been taken to our souls and placed in these phones, and so that the opportunities for really great literature are shrinking just because there isn't a sounding board within so many potential readers. They're just not.
Yes.
Never mind that they don't even have the patience to sit down for 300 pages and read. But even if they did, it wouldn't resonate because their inner life has been so denuded by everything that has been digitalized and externalized. And I sort of freak out.
And people have studied that sort of lack of attention. Like, who's going to sit down with a 700-page novel right now? I would say, so I see that is very real, what you're describing. If we were going to be like slightly optimistic, we could also say, well, there's a couple of things you could say. I think that in the old days, like if you go back to like the 19th century or the early 19th century, novels were considered to be the phones. They were considered to be mindless, frivolous. You're just going to rot your brain. Novels were like what television was when our parents worried about us, right? And now, now somebody's 12-year-old daughter is reading this like horrible pornographic vampire story, and they're like, the parents are like, oh, she's reading a book, how wonderful. They're really excited. So so what does this do to people who write serious fiction? It's sort of liberating, right? So the people that we write for are maybe fit audience, the few, and we don't have to be as commercial, perhaps. So that's one way of looking at it. If you look at a writer like Dickens or Mark Twain, very commercial writers, like they were incredibly popular. They also wrote some really great work, but they had to write all this other stuff, thousands and hundreds of thousands of words. Maybe we get to write less because television and TikTok are taking care of the mindless part of it. So that's maybe one contrarian way of looking at it. But I do see what you're saying, and it's very real. People don't read in the same way. Perhaps people maybe appreciate unplugging better than when they actually do get in the zone and they do read a book. Maybe that's more magical. Maybe it's more special now. So again, I see both sides.
Let me ask you one final question from my side before I turn it over to the audiences. And this is an institutional question, genuinely seeking advice, because we started SAPIR 2 years ago, and we're the subtitle of SAPIR is Ideas for a Thriving Jewish Future. So SAPIR aims to be a journal that not only thoughtfully considers important issues facing the Jewish community, but also offers prescriptive ideas. And in that spirit, should we be doing more to further Jewish American writing in the 21st century? What are the virtues and pitfalls of philanthropic efforts to foster or encourage or create more art with at least semi-explicit Jewish themes?
Well, that's such a good question. Well, I'll answer from personal experience. I got my start publishing fiction and commentary, which is, an old Jewish periodical, much older than SAPIR, which is interested in politics and somewhat in culture. And I was writing stories with Jewish themes. And when I was 17, that's the magazine that I sent my work to. And that's how I got my start.
You'll be pleased to know that when I was 19, I wrote on a lark a book review, which I showed to my father, and he said, you should send this to commentary. And that's how I got my start.
There you go. You see,
in writing as well. Sorry.
So my point is maybe it's in terms of finding an actual platform for the writers' voices in their fiction, in their conversations, in the things that you're doing. But again, I couldn't have started by writing at the New Yorker. But after I had written a commentary and published a book, I ended up writing for the New Yorker. So, I think there's definitely a place for that. And I think always, I guess, and maybe this is just because I'm a maverick, independent, self-employed, independent artist, but I think of it as institutionally, I'm always interested in like direct help and direct platforms for the individual rather than global efforts to other institutions.
Let me turn it over to some of the questions that are coming from our audience. Sarah Siegel asks, ever since the Second Temple was destroyed, haven't we always been in the desert and the promised land at once as Jews? What makes now different other than Sefaria.org?
I think that's great. Yeah. And, if you read the prophets, which I think the other essay about culture references in this issue, it's always sort of like, everything's going to hell and, you're all going to die and, your behavior is going to alienate you forever and you're going to, burn up like cinders, and also you'll be redeemed and also you will come into the land. So both of those narratives definitely coexist, sometimes within the same prophecy.
Mark, Neubauer. Mark, you're watching this, and I'm sorry, I've just mangled your surname. Just asks a simple but very useful question. Allegra, who are your Jewish mentor authors, if any?
I think probably the two most important to me growing up were Sholem Aleichem and Cynthia Ozick.
And you explained a little bit about why Cynthia was so influential. What about Aleichem?
I think really it was his bittersweetness, his humor and sadness at the same time. His work, to me, his stories were like laughter through tears. I love that. I love the way he did that. He had a delicacy that I didn't find, for example, in I.B. Singer.
Let's see. Elliot Wilner asks, there are people who are Jewish, whether religiously, culturally, or politically, either out of conviction or out of habit. It is those Jews, creatures of habit, who are a dying demographic. Yes, I guess. It's sort of a question
That's interesting
itself, but
I guess it depends it depends how strong their habits are or what their habits are based on. One of my earliest characters in my first published story was a Orthodox Jew who doesn't believe in God. He's really just interested in being Orthodox out of habit. He likes ritual. He likes doing it for its own sake. And I was really interested in exploring that paradox and what happens to somebody like that.
I want to ask you, actually, gets back to pieces of our earlier conversation. You talk about the kind of the watermark stain, the tiny, almost atavistic memory of a Jewish connection. Does it fade entirely at some point? Is there at some point where we just won't be writing about Jews, or you won't be writing about Jews? I mean, you paint expansively, and you say correctly, you consider assimilated Jews every bit as much Jewish as Orthodox Jews. I think very much correctly. But is there a line where it just ceases to be Jewish in any way?
So there may not be Jewish people in the story or in the book, but there may be Jewish texts in there in terms of my work. So I don't think it will ever fade away completely. You might just need to shine a light on it, a special light to be able to see it.
Let's see. Another anonymous attendee says, one of the questions in this issue of SAPIR was the appropriate role of Jewish philanthropy, which we talked about a little bit just now. Do you think people who fund culture or the arts can promote a view and try to influence an artist, or do they just need to empower and get out of the way?
Well, I think that philanthropists can promote a view and have some influence by what they choose or who they would choose to fund. But I think but there's no way they can control, what happens after that. And I think that the best philanthropy probably involves having no strings attached and getting out of letting the work develop. I do believe that.
Another question, you've reflected a little bit on the state of reading and publishing, but what about the state of Jewish books in particular? You're speaking to an audience who might have the ability to shape the world of Jewish books in one way or another, publishing, distribution, or the encouragement of writing in specific veins or genres. If you were a philanthropist with $1 billion, nice to imagine, who cared about this, what would you do?
Jewish books. Probably what I would do if I had $1 billion, I'd probably donate it all to Jewish day schools who could promote Jewish literacy and learning, because without that has to come before the books. Those kids will then grow up to be the writers and the readers and carry on the culture. I would donate it to teachers. I would donate it to study of Hebrew language and Jewish history and philosophy.
It's an excellent answer. Let me just close out by asking you, tell us about what you're doing next.
So
you must be going on a book tour, among other things.
Yeah, I've done a fair amount of that. And I am revising a new novel. And okay, fair warning to everybody here, and I don't usually talk about my stuff until it's published, but There are no Jewish characters in the book, but there is one Jewish character, and it is a Jewish book. The book is the character, that the Jewish connection in this novel. And the novel is very much about religion and spirituality and somebody who gets tested very severely. So that is that novel. And then I also, at the same time, wrote a book of short stories, which I'm finishing, and which the story that came out today is part of. And that one is really overtly Jewish. I've always wanted to write like a latter-day family Markowitz about a contemporary Jewish American family. And that book of short stories, there's a story about a bat mitzvah. There's a story about a bris. It's hard to find a good story about a bris. There's a story about a family sitting Shiva. There is a Yom Kippur story set in a Yom Kippur service, not in Hawaii, but a different kind of Yom Kippur service. There's a story about a Seder. So that book really sort of delves into some of the milestones of Jewish life and the marks on the Jewish calendar. And I'm excited about that one too. That's probably coming out after the novel.
And your New Yorker story that didn't, at least to me, appear to have it overtly is Deborah, Richard, are these Jewish characters?
Yeah, they're all Jewish. Yes, they're part of this Jewish family.
And this becomes apparent in the fuller scope of the work.
Yeah. So the little girl, Lily, who's their daughter, the story about the bat mitzvah is her bat mitzvah. And Heather, the second wife who gets married to Richard, she is a Jewish communal leader. So, but it's not in this particular story, but all of these things are unfolded in the book. So that is quite, and I've been working really steadily on this whole project this whole time. So I always feel like, but wait, I am writing, Jewish fiction the whole time.
So I'll just close out by just saying a couple of things. I read Catterskill Falls, I think when I was a couple years out of college, and was actually, for personal reasons, going up to Bearsville and Woodstock and the area around Catterskill Falls quite a lot. And so when it came out, I obviously read it, and it made a profound impression on me, both for two reasons. One was it's a wonderful novel. It's a wonderful story, but it also gave me the sense right after college that you're a little bit older than I am, but not that much older than I am, that this writer's life was possible. And obviously I've done it in a much more polemical vein. And I would never dare to try my hand at fiction, but it made a real difference in my life to have you as a role model. And I think as a Jewish role model, maybe also because you were writing in commentary, irrespective of the fact that my ambitions weren't novelistic, they were writerly. So I've never met you before, but I've always wanted to thank you for, in some ways, putting me on my way as a writer, because I thought, well, it's doable, and that I don't know how large of an influence it was, but it was a real influence. It made a great difference in my own life. So this is a public opportunity to thank you. I also want to just say a few words about our audience, the SAPIR audience. It may be a remnant, but maybe it's a saving remnant of people who care profoundly about all the aspects of Jewish life, not just political or historical or ideological, but also artistic and cultural. And when we talk about ideas for a thriving Jewish future, it's hard to imagine a thriving Jewish future without thriving Jewish novelists, whether they're writing about Jews or not. That's the ecosystem that we are trying to create with SAPIR through the good offices of the Maimonides Fund and my wonderful colleagues at SAPIR, my managing editor, Saul Rosenberg, Felicia Herman, Ariella Saperstein, Mark Cherendorf, the people who support SAPIR. So I just want to thank you, because what we're trying to do is create a community of people who really believe that this matters, not only matters for the way in which we enjoy our life or experience our Judaism, but matters for the way in which we enrich the culture at large. And you've done so much to further that, Allegra. So it's an absolute honor to spend an hour with you. I'm at if someone didn't get it, I'm at Gillette Stadium, improbably in Foxborough, Massachusetts, Usually rooting for the Seahawks, but today I guess we're all Patriots on President's Day. So thank you very much for joining me for the last hour. And I want to thank the audience for participating in these conversations. There are many more to come.